It is 9 o'clock. I'd like to call the March 17th special call town council meeting to order. May we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God.
Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Chair Bell.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Berner.
Here.
Mr. Farrell.
Here.
Ms. Kay.
Here.
Mr. Spencer.
Here.
Ms. Tillerson. We don't have a Mr. McClellan or Mr. Aiken, but we do have Mr. Nicholson.
Thank you. Citizen comments. Waiting, looking. No citizen comments this morning. Maybe there'll be citizen comments by the time we're finished. No old business. The only item of new business is to consider approval of ordinance 2025-07, which is an ordinance to fully repeal and replace our current procurement code, which is reflected in Article 4 of our Municipal Code, Finance and Taxation, Section 401 at SEEK. I want to make a few kind of general observations at the outset to kind of tee this up, and then I will invite a motion to consider approval of the procurement ordinance on first reading. The genesis for this was primarily some ongoing concerns we've had with regard to the application operation of our current purchasing ordinance. There's a lack of clarity in some provisions. It's a little cumbersome in others, and there are some provisions that, quite frankly, are simply contradictory. We had reached out to Mac and his firm, or town attorney and his firm, to assist us with developing a new procurement ordinance. The resident expert at the firm, who's done this on behalf of other municipalities, is with us today, Mr. McQuillan's associate, Nick Nicholson. And so he is the expert that can answer any questions that are likely to arise with regard to the ordinance, because it took me a while to wrap my arms around kind of what's in this, what has changed, how does this operate, how will this operate in practice. There are a couple of guiding principles that underpin this, and interestingly enough, when Mr. Nicholson had sent the first draft of this to us, the one thing that struck me, if you look at the reporting to town council provision, it's actually should probably be reporting to or approval by, it's all it provided for was that any contract in the amount greater than 100,000 would be reported to council. No approval by council, just reporting to council. And I posed the question, I said, that seems a little odd. We generally approve a lot of contracts. The council actually approves contracts. And that engendered a back and forth conversation, which he noted that, well, actually our current ordinance doesn't require approval by council of any particular contract. And this is just actually a procurement policy for competitive bidding as to how you procure goods and services, and further noted that it is typically the case that the legislative branch approves budgets, and then the administrative or executive branch executes on those. You can use an example like the city of Charleston, or a more extreme example of New York City that literally has tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of contracts. Councils don't approve those contracts. Those are all subject to budget authorization, and then the appropriation process is carried out by the executive branch. My view was all fine and well, but that's a little bridge too far from where we've been historically and where we may be in the future. So my view was there should be some continuing role on the part of the council with regard to at least contracts of a certain size, whether that's reporting and or approval. There's a placeholder here for reporting to a certain level and then approval by the council above that amount. The other interesting thing that he noted to me, which I hadn't really appreciated, is that under state law, state statute governing which is the South Carolina Consolidated Procurement Code, there's a 55-page statute that applies to state procurements. There's a single small paragraph thereunder on page 5455 that applies to political subdivisions of the state, which is a municipality, and all the state statutes requires of municipality with regard to procurements is a municipality shall adopt an ordinance or procedure embodying sound principles of appropriately competitive procurement. That's it. No other state law requirements with regard to what a municipality does other than something that is sound principle and appropriately competitive. The framework for this particular procurement policy is that generally all procurements and services should be subject to some type of competitive bidding or review process, except those where that does not necessarily make sense. So kind of the general exceptions for competitive bidding are the sole sourcing provision, small purchases, and there's still some competitive aspect to that, and emergency procedures. But those are also embodied in the procurement and solicitation processes. Then this ordinance also provides for exempting from these policies and procedures certain types of procurements for goods and for services, more professional services. For example, legal and auditing. Those, interestingly enough, are both exempted under the state statute as well. And it also provides the authority of the council to determine not to follow the competitive procedures if it determines, with regard to a particular project, if it determines that it is not appropriate to do so in a particular case. So the other issue that arises in this, and I know that Councilmember Berner had reached out about this particular issue, and I certainly understand, and we can talk about that, is there are numerous references to the mayor, and the mayor making the determination or decision with regard to a wide range of these procurements. Now, the mayor is defined as the mayor and his or her designee, which may be the town administrator, maybe the town treasurer, maybe a department head, it may be a purchasing agent. The point being there that somebody has to be ultimately responsible or accountable for the administration of these policies and procedures. So in our form of government, it's kind of defined as the mayor. Now, he initially had drafted just the director and then defined the director as the mayor, but the director didn't seem to really make much sense, so we just implemented the mayor. So those are kind of some of the that's kind of a broad brush overview of what got us to this point. Before entertaining a motion for approval on first reading and a discussion of the substantive provisions of the ordinance, I would invite any questions to me or to Mr. Nicholson.
Well, I was going to wait until we get into the motion.
Okay, that's fine. At this point, then, I would entertain a motion for approval of the ordinance 2025-07 on first reading.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion.
So, as Brad alluded to, or the mayor alluded to, I wanted to make this perfectly clear in the outset that all of my comments are with respect to the title of the mayor. And as I explained to you a couple of times already, because I want to make sure that you don't take offense, it's not with respect to you, it's with respect to the title. So the overarching concern that I have, there are too many references, and I'm going to go through them, that give the mayor, the title of the mayor, way too much control, and it gives me the impression that it could lead to collusion on bids. For example, so where I'm coming from, page 5, item 3. It states, the mayor has the right to reject any and all bids for cause or without cause. That's a very powerful item in the procurement.
Yeah, because I'm not
Yeah,
sure we have
it's not
exactly
right.
the same, what you said, page 5, which subsection?
At the bottom, the right of rejection and
Okay.
solicit. It's
This under
the,
invitation for bids?
Invitation for bid, yes.
B is section 6.
it's the last 2 lines on that page, or last 3 lines on that page. Okay. At the top of the same page, item 3 also says that the mayor has the right to not accept any bid. And this is a unilateral decision that's made by the mayor. It goes on in other locations to say that this is with respect to sole source in page 7, item E. It states the mayor determines if there's only one source for the required supply, for the sole sourcing. The amount of control by this one position in the government gives me a lot of concern. Now, Mr. Mayor, so what you did mention earlier, New York City has these other organizations, and I've submitted many proposals to cities throughout the country, actually not just New York City, but throughout the country. They have committees, and the committee decides when you get into situations like that. And so what I would propose here is to prevent. To me, it's just dangerous to have one position to have that much control, particularly with respect to the right to reject any bids with or without cause. That a committee can. I don't like the one position in the government doing that.
Well, I'll certainly invite Nick's, kind of professional expertise or thought around that. A couple of observations. By the way, I have no issue with trying to do this appropriate line drawing. And this is not about empowering the mayor per se. But in our current ordinance, and with respect to not only our purchasing ordinance and a host of other ordinance, it simply refers to the town has the right to, unilateral right to reject a contract, for example. It doesn't specify what the town
Understood.
needs.
And that's why we're here now,
Yeah.
because that policy needed
And
upgrading.
then it becomes question, well, the town, at least from our form of government, is the authority of the town, absent a policy decision or ordinance passed by the legislative branch, is reflected through the chief administrative officer, which is
right.
the mayor. So it's the mayor or his designee. That's one point. The other point, part of this is trying to, and I'm not saying this is where we want to land, is trying to be practical.
Oh, it's a great first step.
Yeah.
We have to start somewhere, so this is a perfect
But
first
also
step.
given the size of our town and the size of our administration, the size of our council, is if we set up some committee for every one of these contracts.
No, we can have a standing committee or whoever it is in the town. It could be Public Works plus you plus
Or it
somebody
could be the
from
Ways and Means Committee.
Or
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways you can set up
Yeah.
this group. So I didn't mean a public committee, but it's this group of individuals who are employed by or affiliated with the town.
Well, but then if you start setting up that process, then that becomes itself, I think, would have to be subject to the Open Meetings Act and would be then a body that would itself have to meet and review every contract matter. So the question is kind of where is the line drawn there? But anyway, I would just, I invite.
Yeah, so as an overall statement, I would add to what the mayor said about reading that statute. It said there's only one provision in state law It says all you have to do is pass an appropriately competitive procurement policy or ordinance. And appropriate means what's appropriate to the town of Kiel, right? And so, and who determines what's appropriate? You do. And so, as long as something is just grounded in some sort of just reasonableness, it's going to be upheld. And so, I would argue what you're doing right now shows it's grounded in reasonableness because you're being thoughtful and intentional about passing something. So from the outset, you can sort of craft any way you want to do this operationally the way it's going to work for you. So you shouldn't think there's any sort of impediment otherwise. The point of putting, to me, when we put in the mayor, that's almost just like a definition to set up somebody who's going to be an ultimate in charge. Because if you do, if the policy says throughout, the town's going to determine this, the town's going to determine that, the town's going to determine this. If there's not a clear definition, then some could construe it as, well, the town's got to make this decision. The only way the town can make a decision is doing what you're doing right now, is meeting in an open meeting. Notice, you got to have 24-hour notice, you got to have the whole thing. And so the idea, because procurement is, I mean, it's an operational thing. It's something that's done every day. And so you want there to be some sort of, a mechanism to allow you to do it on a daily basis path of least resistance, really.
All right, I have a suggestion. So this is the way all of my contracts work for me, myself, and I. Whenever I had a change to my contract, or whatever it happened to be, it would go through this big organization, exactly in New York City. It would go through an individual checklist of at least 3 people. And it wouldn't be a meeting. It wouldn't be a meeting, and you would get away from that concern that you mentioned. But each individual had to independently sign off on whatever that contract, the originating or initiating contract was, or a change order was. And so if you can get 3 independent sign-offs, like I used to have to get, I'd be okay with that. I don't like one person being able to unilaterally, with or without cause, eliminate vendors or sign contracts. That to me is super scary.
So paragraph C1 on page 9 talks about the mayor establishing a selection committee. Does this constitute the committee you're talking about?
It would.
That's with regard to one of and that you will see that same construct under 2 different of the competitive sourcing procedures that are available to be used. There are 4 or 5 in here. Invitation to bid, which is the one which is basically, it's a sealed bid process. You've got to very well scope out or spec out the project, and then you just take the low bidder. That's it. Others are request for proposal and request for qualifications. For request for proposal and request for qualifications, it embodies this concept of a selection committee.
All right, but for me, I want to reiterate, because it worked in New York City because of all the potential for graft in that large organization. And it went through a series of at least 3 sign-offs. And each individual would have to agree, yeah, I don't think this bid should be accepted, or vendor should be accepted, or whatever it may be.
So again, kind of looking at a practical standpoint, the state procurement statute is 55 pages. And for all of those kinds of reasons, we have innumerable contracts we enter into all the time. Let's just take all the Arts Council contracts, because they're with the artist and they're the venue. So we have a bunch of them. And they're going kind of back and forth. So,
but I would assume that's not one individual. My concern is only the one individual in control. That's my concern.
but ultimately, I'm the one that's accountable. What we do specify.
It's different.
What we do, well, I'm the only one that executes those right now,
that's
unless
okay.
I delegate. And I can delegate to one individual, at least under our current ordinance, as well as this. So what we've set up in here is a policy for small purchases, which are exempted from the complete competitive bidding process, where, again, it's a starting point. There is like less than 1,000, whether that's the number the right way, it's completely exempted. So that could include department heads, the town administrator, town treasurer. A slightly larger number would be the town administrator and town treasurer, and another one's the town administrator, and then after that, the mayor. So, and we do have our accounting policies and procedures with regard to paying any bills that have, require a couple, two signatures as, to.
Yeah, no, I understand. But, you and I have chatted before, the big need to have a controls audit, which we really, and I
Well,
don't,
that's the meeting right after this, so we'll start talking about that.
so, I don't think any kind of controls audit, because I know it won't, would give that much power to one person.
So, since I'm head of Ways and Means, Mr. Bernard, I hear exactly what you're saying, and I understand where you're coming from. I think the town of Kiel is a bit of a different animal than the city of New York City. Size and scope, graft, corruption, all of those things. I'm not as concerned, and I think about, if you think about the federal government, this is an administrative issue. Who executes, the town council approves it, you need somebody day to day to be executing on these things. And you've got somebody who's coming up with a contract, the specification to design, whether it's Craig or whether it's Brian. I'm not so concerned about having the mayor designee be the sole source signing off on these things. I'm concerned about the audit trail. Absolutely, and that's basically all my questions in here have to do with when does this happen, how will we know, who did it, all of those things. So I want to make sure that we can document why it happened, when it happened, and who was responsible. But I think there's a certain level of operational efficiency that we need in doing this. I hesitate to suggest this, but I hear what you're saying about one person. Maybe another approach not to have a committee is to have a second set of eyes. And so if you need a second set of eyes, you'd have the mayor as designee with concurrence by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. That seems to be. I'm not suggesting that. That's just another way to think about this. But I agree with the mayor that setting up a committee for every one of these things or a lot of these things, the operational response time is going to be slowed down dramatically. I think the important thing you're trying to get to is being able to understand the audit process and who did it and why they did it. I don't think there's any concern that the mayor would do a great job. I think yours is more of a theoretical process about one person versus a committee signing off. And I think given the size and scope of what we're doing in the town of Kiowa, I personally don't have a problem with that.
All right, well, I do. If you remember, before any of us were on town council, there was somebody who stole from the town. So it does happen, and at the outset I said, it's not Brad I'm picking on, it's the position. Who knows who's going to be there in 10 years?
And that's an audit and control issue, exactly.
I understand.
I hear you.
I understand. We can do actually what you talked about. We have the title of the mayor plus then the director, whoever that may be. If it's, you or Stephanie or Brian, whoever it happens to be, I'm okay with that. And it's not going to slow down the wheel of progress because it's, one individual signs off on that piece of paper for the contract, walks it down the hallway to the next person in line. And then they either also sign on the line or don't. It's a checks and balance. It's all it is.
So I think we should distinguish between, and they certainly are related, the procurement of the good of service and the form in which that takes. Sometimes it's just you go out and buy something. Sometimes you're entering into a contract for service. And separate out the process of checks and balances for disbursement of funds. Because we've already approved, more just recently, earlier this year, a revised set of accounting policies and procedures, which were specifically intended to address a few gaps that existed with regard to the prior accounting policies and procedures, and ensuring that there were at least 2 sign-offs. We can certainly invite the town treasurer, the finance director, to also talk about that, to make sure that you had at least 2 people, on any disbursement of cash or funds.
Perfectly fine with that.
And that we are going to, as part of the continuing process, and that's going to start with a meeting that begins at noon, is, undertake an internal control audit to see if, in fact, those accounting policies and procedures need to be further tightened in order to make sure that we avoid any possibility of what transpired several years ago. Right now, this whole policy and procedures is to try to, again, just set up a competitive process for identifying the good or service and acquiring it.
Well, no, it's not. This is for executing contracts. The first thing I talked about, the mayor has the right to reject any and all bids with or without cause. So you can have a bid slate of 5 individuals. This mayor can get rid of 4 of them to get his favorite son in there. That's the whole problem.
May I interject, Mayor, on something?
Yeah.
So that is a very broadly worded statement, and it's broadly worded. Basically, the whole idea of the procurement policy is to give the town as much flexibility as possible while still having some guardrails to make sure you're following appropriately competitive procurement principles. And so the intent behind this section is primarily is when you may get 5 bids that are just trash, and you don't even want to, let's just throw them all out. Or there's no funding, or there's the political wind's changed, this project is not favored anymore, and so we're gonna do all this. Those are all, now there is a concern that with the broad powers, as you state, that a mayor could come in and say, no, and arbitrarily say, no, this person, I'm throwing out their bid. Now, you would be subject to a bid protest there, notwithstanding what the ordinance says. If the mayor goes there and just makes an arbitrary decision.
Right, most likely a bid protest.
You're gonna be subject to a protest and probably lose.
Right.
Right. One sort of, one guardrail that's already here is that again, and you can change these numbers as you all so desire. But right now, any contract over $20,000 is reported. Any contract $100,000 or greater is approved by you all. One of the things that you can do in this approval process is to adopt, and I don't even think it has to be an ordinance, you can just make it a part of your manual or operations manual, however you want to do it. But whenever a procurement item is set forth, you've got a checklist. Who bid? Who presented a bid? Who presented a proposal? Was anybody disqualified? If so, why? Just has some things. You can go down the list and say, well, Mayor, why did you disqualify Corporation ABC? Well, they weren't licensed. Got it. Or it could be, why did you disqualify ABC? I just don't like them. Well, that doesn't sound like a good reason, Mayor. Just because you don't like them. So there's a check already right there that's coming before council. And even smaller items, you come, you say, Mayor, I'm not liking this pattern that I'm seeing of what you're doing with these procurements. And so council always has an oversight in an open meeting that you talk about that, so you don't have to go ways and means or anything else. So that's one sort of check. But to your point, if you want to define the director as 2 people or 3 people, you certainly can, and you can make that to where you're not having to do a public meeting all the time. But I will say that most procurement policies do at some point have somebody where the buck stops, and they're the ones who make the ultimate decision. In larger municipalities and counties, it's the procurement director, or maybe a deputy administrator or something. Every now and then I've seen an administrator do it, but it's typically somebody under the administrator level who has that role, and the buck stops with them.
So it's down in the town staff somewhere.
Yeah, correct. It's a staff role.
So we've elevated this to the mayor,
Right.
not down in the staff someplace.
Right.
Okay.
And does the state have a chief procurement officer? Or?
They do.
Yes.
The state has a chief procurement officer, and when you look at the state procurement code, it gets a little confusing sometimes because The state has a chief procurement officer, and most agencies, and particularly colleges and universities, have their own chief procurement officer. And so sometimes it'll get a little confusing, but yeah, the state has its own chief procurement officer, and the buck stops with that person. It's an appointed, it's not a elected official, it's an appointed, state employee.
They would approve any contracts at Clemson University, the Clemson.
Over a certain Clemson has authority to have approvals up to a certain amount that they can do themselves. As long as they're doing it right, they'll get audited every now and then. And if they're doing things that aren't right, they'll get their wrist slapped, and maybe their authority will go down some, and so the state's got to step in and approve anything at that level. But yeah, by and large, at the end of the day, it is the CPO who is the
And I just want to make one crystal clear, I'm not kind of wedded to
Oh, I know you're not.
anything here, and I am certainly as mindful of anybody as kind of what has transpired, and make sure that we have a set of policies and procedures in place, both in our purchasing ordinance as well as in our accounting policies and procedures, that go as far as we can go to make sure that we're making the right decisions for the right reasons, but then also recognizing that there are practical realities in the implementation of the business of the government on a day-to-day basis. And particularly given the fact that we don't have a large staff, we don't have a separate purchasing agent or procurement officer, and that we've just got 28 or so staff. So I don't know exactly where the lines have been drawn. This was a starting point based on a lot of back and forth with the.
All right, so
Let me
what do
ask
we
Nick
want to
another
do
question.
then?
Nick, sure. You don't mind if I call you Nick, do you?
I would prefer that.
This is just for selection criteria and the size selection criteria. This is nothing in here is about the disbursement of the funds, right?
Correct. That's right.
That's the accounting policy.
That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly
So this is just who we're gonna select.
That's right.
Okay, that makes me even more comfortable that,
Yeah.
I'm fine with the mayor saying this is who we're gonna select, because it's not disbursement of
Now,
funds.
I will say, so you all have some separate accounting disbursement rules in another section of your ordinance and code. That's fine. I mean, there are some clients that I have, for example, that have within their procurement policy who's got check signing authority. You know, check signing authority of over 25,000 is got to be by two people, two of the following three. Anything under that can be one of those three, or somebody on staff, or somebody, maybe a department head or
Yeah,
something.
we have that, yeah.
Yeah.
And you are the person who does a lot of this type of, and so in communities of like format, strong mayoral form of government, same size approximately, is this pretty representative of the kinds of arrangements that they have also set up?
I've done a lot of policies that are sort of on this sort of model that a lot of other municipalities have adopted, and special purpose districts, normally smaller ones. And the reason that this sort of template, if you will, that we used here, and that's changed a lot from that template, from what we had. But the template we had was my goal was to take sort of the good procurement practices from the state and from some other model policies that I was aware of and knew about, and condense them down, because those are really long policies, and some things that frankly a town of your size just doesn't need. So, but to try to condense it down, and to make it workable, make it practicable, give you enough tools in the procurement toolbox, if you will, to be able to go and do pretty much everything you need, and give you maximum flexibility, while at the same time give you some guardrails.
Okay, because I think we've had some really good points raised here during the discussion. We did have a very unpleasant, ugly set of circumstances here several years ago. And I think we are right to have to protect against that. And this particular mayor is going to subject all of these things to probably a lot more attention and deliberation than other mayors in the future might.
That's a concern, that's the issue.
Yeah, so, yeah, but if we can protect against malfeasance by incorporating all of those rules and regulations into some other document, then that sounds like a really good compromise or alternative approach to me. But I would also, I appreciate Russ's concern about it being one person and think, at least we should think about a second set of eyes on this. I'm not sure who it would be. I mean, it could be a mayor pro tem, or it could be the head of the Ways and Means Committee, but I do like the element of having a second set of eyes.
Well, we do have, and again, kind of where we want to have that second set of eyes, which I'm fully supportive of, we do in this have a second set of eyes for any contract for more than, that would be an amount more than $20,000.
Yeah,
Because that's reported and reported to council. We can draw the line where that is.
And I think that the dollar amount is going to play heavily in my decision on this as well, because we're all spending plenty of time without having to deal with the nickel and dime stuff.
Where I guess you have in the procurement process itself, where you don't have the reporting to council or approval of council, is in those under 20,000. So there is the potential where there's approval authority on the part of one or at least a couple of instances, individuals, whether it's the mayor and or his or designee. And I think, what is the, Nick? It's
10,000.
and then right now, small purchases, the town administrator with the concurrence. So right now, basically, as this is stated, we've got to conform it to an exemption for anything under $1,000. This would say for purchases of up to $2,000, essentially the town administrator or town treasurer may purchase the item. So you do have just one individual, and I think we should add department head there. But that's where you would have, again, this is for the sourcing, one person. Two to 10,000, again, whether it's the right number or not, it's the town administrator with the concurrence of the town treasurer. So we do have two. From up to essentially $10,000 to $20,000, the mayor can authorize it. There is supposed to be a shortened, streamlined process and some written basis for not going full competitive. So there needs to be a written record with regard to that. So that's where kind of the zone is. Again, anything above 20, we're proposing, be it 20 to 100, how you move those numbers and whether 100's the right number, be reported to town council. And anything above 100 be approved by town council. We also understand that
Excuse me. Is there a mechanism then between being reviewed by council and let's say that review, that's post facto. Let's say that review runs up against some kind of problem, some kind of issue. Is there a mechanism to drop it back on that approval?
Well, we can't bind future councils, so this ordinance could be revised again or tweaked at any given point in time. I would also note that kind of separate, in a separate ordinance provision, the Ways and Means Committee has oversight responsibility for contracts, licenses, and 4 or 5 different things.
Disbursements.
Disbursement. So the Ways and Means Committee can, any point in time, say, hey, listen, I'd like to get the administration's, explanation for this, that, or the other thing. So you do have that. And again, we have our accounting policies and procedures to deal with disbursement issues. The real concern, there are 2 types of concerns, and Dorota, help me out here, or the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, kind of the embezzlement that occurred before, actually just funds being, cash being sent to individuals and that should not have been, and there was no check and balance. You know, one of the concerns I've always had is, could me, the town administrator or department head or somebody else simply say, here's a contract for Acme Consulting, and it's $20,000, and I've approved this contract, and please pay the monthly assessment. And Acme is actually just a member of their family or doesn't exist. It's simply a shell. So, you know, that's the kind of concern that any kind of governmental entity should be concerned about. My view is we've put in place a lot of checks and balances that did not exist previously to preclude that from happening. You've got to be vigilant. Again, at the end of the day, the best internal controls are only as good as the adherence thereto. So we've got to be, you know, we've got to continue to be mindful. And that's one reason why I think we've all agreed it's so important to have this for really the first time, a separate audit of internal controls to make sure that all our checks and balances reflected in our procurement ordinance, reflected in our accounting policies and procedure are as robust and rigorous as they should be.
Oh, 100%. But to your point, that's what I was concerned about, going to Acme Plumbing or whatever your brother's firm's name is. It's not so much the disbursement of funds, which we have good controls over. It's going to an organization, selecting the contract, and then, you know, the disbursement of funds will be handled according to the current rules and procedures. But it's the selection of whoever that contractor is.
So I
Was concerned.
would just take the other side of that coin. Since we haven't done an audit, we've got the policy and procedure in place. It hasn't been looked at. The disbursement is where the rubber meets the road. That's where the check goes out. That was the problem in the past.
I understand that.
And
but
so the
there's-
disbursement to people, I think it's great to focus on this. I'm just going to say, from my standpoint and looking at this, I want to look at kind of the audit process. I want to know who approved it, when they approved it, why they approved it, the checklists. I'm not so concerned about whether it's one or two people. It's when you go to write that check, and the audit process may or may not pick up part of this. Okay, here's the invoice, here's a check for it. But what if there are two checks? That's what I'm looking for.
The issue that nobody is referring to, we keep going into disbursements, which I don't have an issue with. It's the selection process of the contractor. What happens all the time while you have these controls that I want to have some kind of nominal control is the future mayor selects a firm where he gets a kickback. Your disbursement audit is not going to pick up that kickback because the mayor in the future, 10 years, is selecting his brother's organization, and he says, bro, get me this contract, I'll give you $500 off every invoice I get paid. That's what these controls are for, is to stop the kickbacks and these under-the-table dealings that are going on, which you lose control with the power going to one mayor in this draft format.
So I legitimate concern, and that's certainly something that's happened in other places.
We see it, it's in the newspaper.
It is. So you're violating various probably state and federal laws. So I'm not sure how would a procurement policy in and of itself protect about somebody getting a kickback.
Well, it will help protect it if you have more than one set of eyes. Remember, I've said it, a couple times, the way the draft is written, the mayor, the future mayor, has the ability to reject or any bid for reason or no reason. And he can direct it to his brother.
Well, certainly the more, I'll say this, there have been, and you just mentioned it, there are several examples in the paper. I've done investigations before, and you've got incredibly robust procurement policies with a bunch of checks and balances, and at the end of the day, you'd had somebody at the top who wielded a lot of power and just did what he or she wanted anyway. And so, to me, that goes back to your audit function. Coming back, and that's where your checks and balances come in. If somebody wants to really be on the draft and commit fraud, and they're really good at it, they're going to do it. And you've got to have as many checks and balances on the procurement side, but more so, I think, on the audit side too. But I get it's difficult when you've got somebody writing the kickback check, because that's not going to flow through your
Right.
bank account, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, you do have the conflict of interest policy here at the end that I think would catch what you just talked about. But if it was somebody who's a friend of a friend, or just somebody who approached the mayor at the time and said, "Hey, you get me this project, and we're gonna do this."
And that's the entire reason every public organization I've ever had a contract with has those checks and balances. And again, it's not the disbursements, but I really don't understand why it's so hard just to have a second set of eyes.
No,
really don't.
I'm just trying to figure out how the I'm trying to figure out how it works in practice, because you're referring to page 5, which is the invitation to bid, which is a sealed bid process, and it's the lowest dollar amount. So this doesn't give the mayor or anybody else the authority to accept a bid other than the lowest dollar amount. It does give the town, it reflected through the mayor, the unilateral ability to reject any bid. But if there's another process for saying the mayor, and with the concurrence of somebody else, can reject the bid, as long as the town has the authority, I think it's in the town's interest to be able to reject a bid if it determines it's in the town's best interest.
Right, and so the same could be true, I guess, in the RFP process, when we're talking about a selection, there you do have another set of eyes. You've got a committee.
You have a selection committee.
You've got a committee that's making the choice of who's going to choose. And frankly, you could do the same thing. It's not, most people don't do it, but you could do the same thing with bids too. You could have a selection committee, and the selection committee vets the bids as a whole. And they go through and they say, and if the mayor goes, "Well, no, we need to reject this," well, why, Mayor? I mean, why are we rejecting this bid? It seems perfectly reasonable that they meet all the
Right.
specs, are responsive, and so.
Right.
So that could be one of your checks right there, is to have the committee for both bids and sealed proposals. The committee's job for a bid, if you will, the scope would be much smaller, because they're just making sure that the bids meet the specs, et cetera.
And moving away from the public market, it's what I did thousands of times, where even on private projects where I was running in construction, you would have a public, not meaning in the public venue, but you would have 5 people who would be on the selection committee, even on private jobs, and you open all the bids at the same time in front of that entire group. And then we all agree to what the lowest bidder is. We all agree that he's a responsible bidder, doesn't have anything wrong in his proposal, et cetera, and so forth. I have never been on a single job anywhere where only one person has that control. Never, ever, ever. And I have probably opened 100,000 bids.
Well, just to be clear, our current ordinance doesn't provide for all those review
And
processes.
that's one of the reasons why it has to be revised.
But I mean, Nick, can we? And I have no issue at all. I mean, if it seems fine because we do have a committee for requests for proposals and a request for qualifications. The only one where we don't is the invitation to bid.
And one could say that it's implied, because it says bids shall be evaluated based on the requirements. You could interpret that and say, well, it's got to be the mayor, because you said the mayor's the director. If you want to make it explicit, you could say a committee consisting of X or chosen beforehand shall evaluate.
Yeah, we can add, I don't have any issue. I mean, any practical issues that you can think of?
From a bid standpoint, I was just thinking of some practical things that we do. So as an example, when we went out and purchased that, whatever you call that little vehicle that our Public Works Department.
UTV, the utility vehicle?
What we did there was they essentially went out and found maybe 3 companies and asked them to essentially submit kind of bids to them. Would this then trigger having, how would that process then look? There's some other things that maybe, I would say smaller scale, but probably,
Agreed, yeah.
you know, 10,000, 13,000, which is still, you know, money, but still 10, 13,000, where we've said in our, I don't remember if it's in this one, and I think it's in this one as well, it's our old one, that we at least have to get 3 bid proposals. So it's mainly out of our Public Works Department. They would then contact companies and have them email them cost. How would that relate to the invitation to bid? I understand maybe that's a much larger, when we purchase our vehicles, we have something in here, we use the state or the county's procurement process. We're not doing an invitation to bid, we're using their procurement process and using the company.
So
But-
an invitation to bid is only one of the processes of competitive purchasing. I mean, the example you used, which I said, wow, I'm not sure we really want to use that example. He says, you've got a parking lot that you want to resurface, so it's kind of a commodity project. And then that's when classic example of when you just do sealed bid and the lowest contractor comes in. But you've got to make sure, to our point about our leisure trail, that you really spec out appropriately. So it's clear, truly an apples to apples, everybody's bidding on exactly the same thing.
And to be clear, I'm not a big fan of just sealed bid procurement.
And by the way, we don't have to use the sealed bid process. There's not any one that has to be used, but we can still add those bells and whistles, add a separate set of eyes. You did raise a good issue, Stephanie. Again, I'm trying to think through all the practical issues. So one that recently came up was the plotter. So we currently lease a plotter is the very large, I mean, print, big map, and we currently lease it, and we're going to redo the contract. So the annual amount is only what 600, 600. No, how many? What's the $320 a month, so it's $3,000 a year, but it's a 6-year contract. And then we were saying, well, does it make sense to continue to lease this or just purchase it? And then we immediately just kind of looked. They gave us a price. You go on the internet and you could see a couple of other prices, and you kind of just do the math. And we concluded to go ahead, I think, with the lease. But that's one where, gee, we went through a process, and it should have been okay to say we made the decision to purchase it if we had chosen to go down that route, even though it would have been about $13,000, because we looked at sources of publicly available sources of pricing. We did not go down there. This procurement would actually allow. It would actually allow for that. But those are the kind of the daily things that kind of come up is, you know.
Oh, you need a threshold, no question
yeah.
about it. You have a certain value, and what we did on private and public jobs, it will be 25,000 was the threshold where you'd have to have a group of guys and girls, you know, involved in making sure there's nothing nefarious in the selection going on.
Nick, I have some other questions, and they relate to some of the more subjective bids that we might get for projects. So for instance, rather than the cost of gravel and stuff like that, we go out and ask for bids for a plan, whether it's a comprehensive plan or it's a marsh management plan, but something that includes a lot more subjectivity. And so you have a lot of different approaches to that kind of a plan. I have an issue with the requirement to award a bid to the lowest bidder in that kind of instance, because there's so much more going into that bid process, approaches and scope and
I agree completely. I think that's when you use process where you could have much more than price.
Yeah, the request for qualifications, request for proposal, there is no aspect. It's only the invitation to bid where you are bound by the lowest price.
So that's a whole different process.
Yeah, completely different process. They're separate processes.
Valuation factors
So you
I
can,
rescind.
now, you can, for example, we're about to go out with our new landscaping contract. That is a combination of quantitative price, and we're setting and qualitative factors. With some, like a consultant or for regard to a particular project, it may be entirely qualitative, but we can.
That's okay.
Yeah, we can do that. Again, we just need to have a reasonable procurement policy, and all of this reflects a reasoned and reasonable procurement policy. And again, at the end of the day, we have given ourselves the authority here to, at any time that we think it's appropriate, completely bypass these procedures. But that would only be if the council, qua council, did that acting by ordinance or resolution in a public meeting.
Nick, explain to me where we would use invitations to bid versus requests for proposals. And the reason I ask is, maybe we can search the RFP process. There's a selection committee. It's not the mayor. The invitation to bid, it's the mayor chooses or doesn't choose. So when would we use one versus the other?
Well, again, I think we could, if we wanted to, we could certainly put the committee into the responsibility, et cetera. But there's no direction in the state procurement code, the default is low bid. That's the default. And if you're going to use request for proposals, agency that wants to use request for proposals has to
And we have that in the evaluation factors. We don't have to take the low bid in the RFP process.
What I'm saying, your question is, when do we use a bid versus RFP?
Yes, sir.
And so, what I'm saying is, in the state system, it is you shall use low bid unless you say there is a specific reason to use an RFP. In this procurement code, we do not have that. One of the reasons we don't have that is because way earlier in my career, they kept getting sued by somebody. A bunch of lawsuits. One of the things he would say is, well, yeah, you made this written determination to say to use request for proposals. That's a wrong written determination because sealed bids should only be used all the time. Frankly, Greenville County got tired of those. I said, well, why don't we just say it's the county discretion. You can choose RFPs or sealed bids. That case went up on to the court. It's your discretion. So a very long answer to your question is there's no direction in there about when you use a sealed bid versus a sealed RFP. Mayor or staff or however you want to do it for any particular job. If you never do a sealed bid again, that's fine.
You know, example of one of the things we've talked about is, and this probably, the dollar amount would not be sufficient to trigger the need to do this, but putting in, let's just assume hypothetically that it was going to cost $25,000 to put in two new handicap parking spaces, carve out an area of the island so they're closer to the front entrance, which we're going down that path. But let's just say that was estimated to cost $25,000, so it'd fall outside the small purchases process and wouldn't fall into any other exemption. That might be the type of example where you could spec that out pretty well and then just go out for an invitation to bid to 3 different contractors, and you're just going to take the lowest one.
Yeah, in theory, that's true, yes. I would agree, with that. You'd have to spec it out correctly, though.
But
yes.
that's not one that really you need to do, kind of request for qualifications or request for proposal. This is pretty cookie cutter. It's this many square feet, this many inches,
Agreed.
and roll curve, and,
Right.
and that's it, boom.
So just correct me if I've misread this. So I'm going to come back to number 1, but right now that's the mayor. Number 2 is there's a committee to decide. Number 3, emergency, that's the mayor, and that seems appropriate. 4, sole source, you're not really worried about the mayor's brother-in-law, getting selected. 5, small purchases, that's fine. Qualifications-based selection, I don't know whether that's a committee or not, and the reverse auction, I don't know. So like 1 has a committee and 3 certainly don't need a committee. So I think we're talking about the invitation to bid right now is really the big one we're talking about.
I've got several questions and comments. And we were talking about one of the first ones, and I'll just say for background, I've been involved in big and small procurements, thousands of them over my career. And I've seen a new term today that I've never seen before called invitation to bid. And I don't see where we're doing a lot of describing what these are and the applicability, but it's not written in the policy. So reading this cold, I didn't understand when invitation to bid versus RFP versus other things are being done. They read very similar to me. And the term sealed bid has been used a lot in here, but that doesn't show up in here. I derive it after reading 2 pages, but it seems that we ought to have a simple statement that says, here's where this applies, and it's a sealed bid, lowest price. Because it takes a lot of words to get to that point, it seems like to me.
I think policy says invitation.
Yeah.
I like that term, to be honest.
But by the way, just the reason we set up a special call meeting to focus on this, invite Nick, is because I had all these questions. I've had the benefit of, a couple of hours on the phone with him, or if not more than that, trying to understand.
I was glad you led with that.
Yeah, understand try to how this all works together. And it's not kind of intuitively obvious. You do need to work through it, and so it's a legitimate question. But the sealed bid, the invitation to bid, is essentially a sealed bid process.
I think it'd be great just to write that and put it in there. That way it's clear.
Just
one sentence.
well, but I don't know what you're saying. The one sentence.
Just say an invitation to bid is used as a sealed bid process where lowest price is the determining factor. Just at the very beginning.
Certainly low price, once a contractor is responsive and responsible, I do think.
That's what it is. Do you just want us to relabel it?
The policy.
I just
price is going to be the only criteria.
wonder why you have to read more than 2 pages to kind of think through it and have to step back and go, okay, what is this process, where one sentence can explain it pretty simply. Sure, or applicability or something like that.
Well,
I had to read it like 3 times to.
no, I as did I. That's why.
And I don't think people should have to read it 3 times when we can use a clear sentence to say what it is. It's the beginning, Invitation for bids is a sealed bid process.
And we can certainly add a descriptive sentence.
Absolutely.
Under B before the notice. I mean, just as a.
We could, to Stephanie's point, we could have a definition that said the invitation for bids are used typically when when prices should be the sole factor, where there are
Yeah, if you want to
pretty
put
simple, pretty simplified means. Sure, we can do that. Yeah.
List it in the definitions, that's fine.
Well, I mean, it's not really a definition. It's just a description.
Mm-hmm.
A one-sentence description under B before 1 on page 4.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think his point was, this is only one process. We may determine not to use this particular process, in part because we don't think we can, other than procurement of a good, we don't think we can adequately spec out the project.
One, I think maybe it was Luke that said that this is more of an operational focused policy, but I just think we need something like that.
Okay.
The other thing I noticed is might be helpful to review use of will, shall, and may. And I'm thinking like in paragraph 2G4, let me find it again.
What page? What page?
Let me find it here and tell you. Page 9. As you read through the committee, in paragraph 4, it says, the selection committee on the second line may hold interviews with at least 3 firms. Then later it says if there's less than 3, that they shall. So may versus shall seems to be a little bit in conflict here.
I had seen that one may as well, and that probably should be a shall, because it says you shall, but if there aren't 3, then you don't have to do 3. You just do it with as many as are qualified.
And it's actually with a smaller amount that it's got the
well,
shall.
I would say this is consistent where if you could make it consistent, but you could also say everything's we're going to do interviews all the time, or we're going to give ourselves the discretion to do it. And if that's the case, you just change everything to may. But sometimes you don't do interviews. You don't.
Oh, you're saying, okay, there is no requirement to do an interview.
I'm okay with may. I'm just thinking
Okay.
change
Okay, yeah,
shall
I mean, that's,
to may.
I can see the confusion there. So you just change it, everything to may in there, then you get, I think
Okay.
it becomes much clearer.
And then I don't see a process when we have mods or changes to existing contracts.
That's modifications, is that what you said? So that's a good question. So in a lot of procurement policies that I see, or the adding with the accounting policies, is the change order. I mean, first of all, your contract should set out how you're going to do a change order, right? Mm-hmm. And then, to me, the control, then you're going to decide is, okay, well, who has the authority to approve that change order? If it's just if you got a contract rep who you name in the contract, they're going to do it internally, which you could. I mean, a lot of clients I say have any change order over, say, $25,000, $20,000, whatever. It's got to be approved by them. Mm-hmm. And that's either part of the procurement policy, or it's in their accounting policy, or some other way. But that is certainly something you have in there to have another checks and balance. Otherwise, it's just going to be determined in the contract documents and how you do the change order.
And part of the reason I ask is, and I realize we're talking about Keel Island versus Department of Defense, but you can get into some significant money relatively as well. I've seen quite a few contracts where the changes and modifications value is much larger than the base value that was originally awarded. So a lot of money could be in play.
Yep, it happens.
So I do think we need to have a policy on that.
And that it does raise a good point. To the extent that you initially have a contract that's like $15,000, then all of a sudden it morphs into, which is going through a non-reporting to council, non-approval for council. All of a sudden it starts morphing into a $50,000 or $75,000 or $100,000. Now, I'm trying to think. That becomes more of an issue on a project-related basis, and this kind of relates a little bit to the exemptions. So the exemptions, which for professional services, one of the ones we just have essentially a retainer agreement with Nick's firm. There is no contract amount. We have budgeted amounts for legal services, which are the only real constraint on that. But, there is no contract amount.
Yeah, it's a task order contract.
And we're likely going to have that with regard to engineering
Yes.
services. We've got to
Task
come up with
orders.
one. So,
Yes.
and the question is, if it's an hourly, if you're just charging on an hourly basis and we're trying to get advice and counsel as opposed to a specific working on a specific project, how does that work in
Well,
practice?
what we've done, or what I've had to do before, where I would have contracts with no limit, I would need, in accordance to the terms of the contract, to get pre-approval for whatever the task is I'm about to perform on that hourly rate. So the hourly rate is set, but if I wanted to go out and paint this room, I would have to go and submit an estimate that would become the new change order amount for painting the room. It would take 10 hours times whatever the agreed upon hourly rate is. So it's called a task order contract.
Still not quite sure how that fits in.
Well, you would go through the change order process, as Nick indicated, which is prescribed in the contract, and it would tell you the steps you need to go through for each individual task.
So, but, yeah, I mean, task. So, for example, I think we want to go out with an RFP or an RFQ for civil engineering services to the town that would, the services, the engineering services would include, traffic management analysis, stormwater
Yeah, but
management.
that's definable. I mean, that, or lump summable, if you will.
But I mean, saying we don't, all the contract is to qualify people in an hourly rate. And then at any given point in time, we will simply say to select one of those firms, can you come give us an estimate of the cost to, repave Beachwalker Park? Or can you please review our stormwater management ordinance? Or yeah.
Yeah, so it's what I just described for, in that scenario, you would then agree to a number of hours it would take to perform that individual analysis, and you would pay at whatever the contractual unit rate is.
But we
Who
don't.
agrees to the change order is what I'm waiting for.
What's that?
Who agrees
Yeah,
to
well,
the change
but we
order?
don't do that with legal. We don't do that with accounting and auditing. So that's the thing I'm struggling with. We don't have a task order every time, there is not a task order associated with Nick's work on the procurement policy.
Well, I didn't have legal contracts, maybe they're generically in the industry handled differently, but with respect to Luke's question,
Yeah.
the change order for that new task order would have to be approved by the
So
town.
you guys are talking about two different things.
Yeah.
You're talking about a project
Yeah.
that has a specific dollar in it, and we're gonna add, instead of 2 spots, we're gonna do a 3rd spot. That's a change order. He's got a consulting contract that's kind of open-ended, and
Yeah.
anytime we need a lawyer, we need Nick, or we need, those are different things.
They are completely different things, and I'm talking about the same. I had consulting contracts with the same thing. I had an agreed upon hourly rate, and it's still a task order. I would have the contractual rates, and I use the painting of the room thing. Mr. Berner, I need your firm to paint this room. And it's a change order to that contract, and would have to be negotiated and agreed upon by the two parties.
You're talking more like adding a 3rd parking spot. Even though it's agreed upon rate to build a parking spot, the consulting is just an open-ended consulting agreement. We want consulting services from lawyers, and we just call them and they come in.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, just can you?
And the
So
same
it's
thing
just
for me.
different.
So I was trying to use the painting of the room as an example. As you know, Luke, so I was on a consulting agreement for litigation services, which is rather open-ended. In order to get to the end game of writing an expert report, I would have a change order to look at individual things on an hourly basis for whatever the attorneys directed me to do. And that would be a change order to my contract, because you can't pay upon it unless the dollar amount is approved. You can't go over that dollar amount. I would have to have a change order to raise the contractual amount every time I had a new
I understand what
task.
you're saying. I don't understand how it applies here. Unless it's we budget for $600,000 for legal services, and if we go over that, then that's a change order. Or is that we just exceed the budget? How does that work, Mr. Mayor?
That's, right now, we just
We just go
whenever
over.
we need legal services, we I call up the firm, or planning commission calls, or Stephanie calls up the firm, or somebody else does, and they bill us at their hourly rate. I review those bills. We track whether, in fact, we're kind of on consistent with the budgets that we've approved, and then if not, then we'll note the variance, and as necessary, the council may have to approve an adjustment in the budget. But other than that just process, and I'm kind of envisioning the same thing with kind of general engineering consulting services, but I would separate out those from, for example, do the new wing, then we're going to have an engineer, that's going to be a project, and there's going to be engineering cost associated with that project, but it's kind of a general, almost like legal, we want to just be able to say, can you give us something like this, and it's going to take an hour or two, it's going to take an hour or two, but it's not a change order, it's not a task order, it's simply just like calling up Nick. But
Well, my experience, it has to be for the reasons I just said, because you can't pay above the contract amount. So you always have to increase the
there is no contract amount.
I know, for the legal, I got it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're wrestling with,
Yeah.
because the legal doesn't have the contract amount. In my experience, I always had a contract amount I had to increase. So it sounds like that's a hole that we need to fill here.
Well, but there's a lot of engineering contracts too they're open-ended. They don't have an amount. You have as you said, you have an agreed upon master agreement with terms and conditions.
Yeah.
And it says for every scope of work, the engineer is going to submit a work authorization, a task order, whatever you call it.
Work order.
That's whatever they call
Work
it.
order, yeah.
And so, and then once you get that amount, and then you go forward. I don't view that, and this is probably splitting hairs. I don't really view that as a procurement issue. I view that more as a budgeting issue. I view that as an authorization issue, which are certainly all tied up with procurement. But the procurement of that is, okay, how do we select that engineer or group of engineers to be on that list to submit work orders? Once that procurement is over, okay, then you may want to have some contract management or contract administration guidelines in place to do that, or some accounting guidelines. Who's going to approve it? What's the limit of their approval? But that's more of an operational thing that is separate and apart from procurement. I know I'm splitting hairs a little bit there.
Well, yes and no, because there's a stress though that happens, because if the mayor or whoever calls you up and you say, okay, I'm going to do this job and this research, and it's taking me 20 hours, and then the mayor says 20 hours should have taken only 5 hours. Now you're in a stress situation. And that's what happens when you don't have these pre-approved task orders.
but
Yeah,
those,
I mean, that's the world I live in all the
yeah,
time.
yeah.
People come
I would need to defer to somebody else on how much time could be spent on engineering. Believe me, I certainly on legal, I will push back. And one particular firm I did, and I said, we don't need 3 lawyers on one call, and if you want to have your 2 associates on the call, that's on your dime. But
Go for it.
Yeah, go for it. But and by the way, going way back, there's nothing to do with the town. I would always get pushback on invoices I would get where I knew that the firm this was not a case of first impression. They were the expert in this. They literally had to press the button to print out the document and just change names.
We're going far afield here. I don't know how we got in this rabbit hole, but I'm going to dig out of this rabbit hole, because that's not why we're here.
So, so part of my question about the modification process is you let a contractor do leisure trails, and then you want to do work on town hall, for example. And so where do we have the guardrail where they're changing the scope? And I think we need to have some kind of a guardrail that you can't let a contractor do one kind of delivery and then you modify it to do something else without a competitive bid.
So the example, I think, a perfect example, but that could be like we have on-call engineer, Kimberly Horn. They started with the town doing one project, like a comprehensive traffic analysis, or they did work on Beach Walker, and then we say, okay, can you now look at Mingo Point? Okay, can you now look at Anvil West? So I guess this question is, how do we document or memorialize the fact that we maybe is using the same contract, but keep adding to their scope? Is that essentially?
That's it, yeah.
That's I mean, that's a concern, because that can happen. Somebody can say, oh, let's just keep renewing. Let's just keep renewing this contract forever, because these guys are great, and so that can be an issue unless there's really specific guidelines. I mean, the state, with respect to change orders, the state typically has some guidelines. I think there are more than their regs and in the statute. That says if there's a change order over X percent of the contract, there's another vetting process. Now, they may allow it, but there's an extra layer of a vetting process.
Yeah, I think dollar value or scope are the two tripwires.
Yeah, it can be, it's dollar value and/or a percentage of the contract.
Well, but I want to kind of distinguish again, it's the same thing you were raising, as two different things. The Kimley Horn would be, we should have just an open-ended contract with one or more engineering firms that would allow us to get there, to look at different related issues.
That's
a
true.
separate issue is if we bid out a project and there's a project amount, and then it's proposed there are change orders coming in to say the scope of the project has changed or expanded, and then we don't have a good mechanism in place.
I'm thinking the same thing. It's either got to come back to Ways and Means, because you're changing the budgeted amount for some project. And it's also got to somehow be in the accounting policy, so we're not paying for a change in scope without authorization
But
of a
is
change in
that,
scope.
to Nick's point, is that a procurement policy matter? Is that something that's addressed through the procurement policy, or is that something that's addressed through the budget review process?
I think you can pick either or both.
It's either or. I mean, this, what we're talking about now is just one small piece of your entire umbrella, if you will, of ordinances. You've got your whole, and they all work together. They should work together. And so, yeah, it could be in this policy, you can have another policy. But they all have to work together, and you have to use them together. You don't use them in a vacuum.
As Nick has noted, this is all about just selecting a firm to do a project.
Right.
It's got nothing to do with the dollar amount,
disbursement, yes.
The scope of that project. And it just simply says if the project's going to be above $150,000, you've got to go through this process. And
The guardrails in the Ways and Means kind of ordinances, I'm fine with that, just to make sure we've got a
Well,
guardrail.
now, where we get to is, at least with the, any contract amount greater than 100,000, at least as proposed here, would have to be approved by council. So council is actually the one, upon recommendation of the administration, but the council's the ones actually determining the parameters of that particular contract.
And maybe it's just minor little surgery of any awards or changes, at the right places. So or modifications, because, again, we could have a contract awarded and somebody's taken this literally to the letter of the law, and maybe we're going to catch it through the audit and financial ordinances. But if they're saying that, well, it's not an award, I made a modification.
I don't think we should solve it here. I agree with you. I don't think we should solve it here, though. I think we should set that as a takeaway and have somebody talk about change order process and approval.
Thanks.
And I think that's really important, because I agree with Councilman Berner and you that needs to be something that can come up routinely, and then distinguish between an open-ended contract and a purchase order.
Because it's not really a procurement. At that point in time, you've selected the firm, and it's a $150,000 contract. It's a question of a $50,000 potential change order. You're not going out to kind of resolicit the whole contract. That makes no sense at all.
I do kind of think it's a
Open budget.
procurement still, but yeah.
And if
So
I-
you're procuring
Budget
additional on top.
But
You're just going through a different method to do it. You're going through a change order or modification
And if I can-
process.
Okay.
If I can just add as an example, when we built this building, so there was a municipal committee, and we had a lot of change orders. They did not come back every time. I'm trying to go back and I'll look at my notes, but as I recall, through the approval process and procurement process, essentially there was a set amount, I think, with contingencies, and as long as they fell within that, all the change orders went through the municipal committee. They reviewed them. Once they okayed them, then the mayor pro tem at the time who was over that, they're the ones who signed off on it. But it was all established at the beginning of the approval process, and then the change orders just went through the committee to review and
And we
approve.
just did something like that just recently where we, and I don't remember what the project was, but
It
we
was the
authorized
leisure
the mayor
trail.
to have a
Leisure trail.
$50,000
the
change
leisure
order.
trails, yeah.
So it's,
I mean, that's a great point. I mean, you could, but particularly if you had a big capital project, I mean, I would think all of you are probably gonna be involved in that in some form or fashion. And so even for those projects, you can set almost your own sort of regs and
Yep.
specifications for that project specifically.
I'm just thinking as a matter of policy, we're trying to get a policy, so.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and we want to make sure it's clear and understandable.
Yeah.
all right, so let me bring this back if I can, and I'm on page 4, the source selections and contract formation, the methods for source selection, and there's 7 of them listed. And I've gone through the notes, and I'm going to go in reverse order because it makes it, I think, it easier. But the reverse auction, the mayor pre-qualifies, and then it's price-driven, full stop. Okay, so there's no,
And reverse auctions aren't typically used. I don't think the towns ever use.
but there's no subjectivity. My point, there's
yeah.
no subjectivity there. Number 6 is qualifications-based. That's a committee decides who wins. Okay, so I don't think anybody has a problem with that. 5 is small purchases. That's a single decider. I don't think small purchases like pens and pencils, that's a problem.
Well, that's anything under 20,000.
Right.
Okay.
Sole source, so that's, if your brother-in-law's the sole source, well, that's, your brother-in-law's gonna get the business. There's no subjectivity in the deciding if there's, it's a
would-
sole source.
I don't agree with that one.
Well, I'm being facetious,
No,
but if it's a
I
sole
under-
source,
I
if one
understand
guy's
that.
supplying satellites, we have to buy the satellite from the one guy.
If that is the case, yes, you have to make sure there really is only one sole source.
I'm assuming that there is only one sole source.
Well,
okay?
I noted that language I had requested to a written, was not,
A written determination to
Yeah.
show why it's a sole
yeah, but that
source.
was not included.
I thought I saw it in there because I went looking for it.
No, well, no, there was, it simply says determines in writing. There was an additional and reasonably detailed basis for that language.
I mean, we can flesh that out.
Yeah, there was supposed to be some additional language there, which
Yeah, we
will
can
add,
flesh
that actually exist in our
Because
current,
remember, when we were going for legal assistance in Captain Sam's, or I should say, the development agreement, Mac was the one who came out and said there's nobody else involved, or nobody else in the state who could do it, which surprised the hell out of me. But we had cover because Mac gave us that direction. I have a hard time still believing there's only 2 people in the state who can do this, but that's what Mac says.
he said there were only 2 that were expert in development agreements, and 1 is conflicted. That's what kind of basically what they said.
I still, regardless, but I have a hard time thinking there's only 2 people in the state.
Okay, can I
There's a
finish here?
reason
Because,
that 1 is used by every developer.
Mayor, we don't need to decide whether Mac was right or wrong. I'm trying to get us off the dime here. So sole source, assuming that that's correct, and you guys can put in language to validate that,
But
that's a single,
Nick, just to note, it was language for, that we had added, when I was a council member, asked that we added to our current sole sources, written documentation must include the determination and reasonably detailed basis for the proposed sole source procurement. So just a little bit more than just the in writing.
okay, emergency procurement, I don't think there's any problem with the mayor signing for emergency procurement. We don't need a committee for that. The RFP process, number 2, there's a committee for that. So what we're really talking about in terms of who's going to be the deciding factor for all of these, 2 through 7 are, I think, straightforward. It's only number 1. Do we want a committee or somebody other than the mayor?
I'm certainly, I have no
Do
problem.
we have a recommendation for that? Anybody want to make a recommendation?
I think if it's sealed bid, lowest price, I don't know that we need a committee necessarily.
Well, it comes down to whether the bidder is responsible or not.
True, and then it gets responsive. Yeah.
Responsive, yeah, responsible.
But as Nick noted, if you want to have a committee with regard to a sealed bid, they would have a very limited mandate.
Very limited what?
Mandate. There's
Yeah, it's, are they responsive, are they responsible? And who's the lowest? Who, of
Yeah.
those,
Yeah.
who's the lowest? And where the RFP is, are they responsive? Are they responsible? All right, let's look at these criteria. Who's got the better experience? That takes some work. Who's got the best team for our job? That takes some work. And so it's just more involved evaluation process.
So can we use the language, or something like the language that's in number 7, the reverse auction?
I think if we just put in committee language like we have in the RFPs in the bidding, that should suffice, I would think.
Mayor assigns a committee.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So I have one other thing.
Yeah.
So we talked about things like change orders. What if we've got a project where, let's just say that the initial cost of a plan development is, excuse me, the development of a given plan is $60,000. And let's just say that it's an environmentally focused study. And then 3 years later, we want to go back and continue with that study. So that's not a change order, but there is a lot of value in going back to the firm that did the first study, because they don't have to go back and do all of the legwork that was involved.
Qualifications-based selection, number 6.
So is that covered?
Well, so one of the questions, you're raising a very good question. Yeah, again, the default is a competitive selection process.
And they're probably going to win because they did it before.
And so then the question becomes, like, we've had one firm that's done all our kind of beach analysis. And that contract essentially keeps getting re-upped. We have not gone through a new competitive selection process each time. We certainly could, but you're going to end up exactly in the same place, because they have historical data that we need, they have unique knowledge,
Right.
and a whole host of things.
Building on all of
To me,
that
it's
experience.
I think it's a choice how you do it, and I'm going to use the other example. So I spoke really quickly, said it's qualifications-based. But what, for example, if we wanted to do, revisit the comprehensive plan?
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a consultant who did all the work the first time, and maybe we'd probably want to go back out for an RFP because we weren't happy with the work. So I think there's some judgment that we have to use, but if you've got somebody who's working well and you just want to repeat the same data, then I think you'd use the qualification space. But if you had any question about whether the data was suspect or whatever, then you go back to the RFP process.
And I actually think it could apply sole source as well, because that would be a
Sure,
reason to do
you might have a
sole source.
change and it might be new sources, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not automatic that you'd go to those, but if you did your due diligence and you knew there's only one source, or these were the guys who did a good job the first time and they're,
I
the
do
mayor
have a lot of
documents
clients
right
that will say, well, that's really a sole source. I said, it's really not.
yeah.
They've done your work forever, and they're really good and do a great job, but there's other people who do it. And by definition, that's not a sole source.
So how would you,
So there's two ways you could do it that way. You could do the qualifications-based thing. The problem always there is if you know you're gonna pick somebody, they're gonna win, you're gonna tick off the other people who you put out an
Right.
RFP. They say, well, it was in the bag.
Yeah, wasted my time and I did all
Yeah,
this
so-
work.
So
and
that's not a good thing. You've got a mechanism in here, it's where this council can come and exempt any project from procurement. Take a vote, you say, you just said, let's just call it, soil studies. You make a motion, I make a motion that we retain XYZ Corporation, this project. They did the same thing 3 years ago. I make a motion that we do not use procurement because of the reasons we just talked about. It's not, we're gonna pick these people, we like them, and it's just the best thing to do to go ahead and exempt this project from procurement. I move that
So
we-
one interesting thing
And
about.
that's an ordinance.
Yeah,
That's a 2 readings.
Does it have to be an ordinance, or is it just a
I
resolution?
would recommend it be an ordinance, and the reason I say that is because there was a lawsuit about this this ordinance in here is written almost exactly like that ordinance, that lawsuit. And it involves Sumter County, and Sumter County had an ordinance where they exempted, I think it was record services, or maybe trash hauling services. Anyway, the contractor who wanted to bid on it was a little miffed, and so brought a lawsuit and said, wait a minute, I understand you only have to adopt ordinances embodying appropriate competitive principles of procurement, but this isn't competitive. This ordinance itself says no procurement. And so by definition, it is not competitive. And so he challenged it as an illegal ordinance. It went up to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said, we get what you're saying, but a county government, just like a municipality, has tremendous discretion under home rule. And so they upheld it. And they said the reason we're upholding it is because in this instance, it's got to be an ordinance. And so the county is going to have three readings. You would have 2 readings. And so you would have somebody come in on your first reading or second reading, and they go, well, wait a minute, Councilwoman Kay, why are you exempting this from procurement? This makes no sense. This makes no sense to public comment, et cetera. And so the court said there, we think there's enough checks and balances, it's okay to exempt it. And so you don't use it all the time. It's something that's you don't use much. That's why I would recommend an ordinance. You certainly could do a resolution. I think you're safer doing an ordinance.
Although the ordinance, you've already passed the ordinance.
You've passed the ordinance for an overall procurement.
But you passed an ordinance that says that towns
That's right.
can,
Yeah.
and it strikes me as that's kind of overly belt and suspenders, or overly cumbersome to have given yourself that authority and then to basically say, well, we have to go back through the ordinance process again.
You certainly have the discretion to change it to a resolution. I would say there's not a lawsuit out there that says you can do that. There's not a case out there that says you can do it. And so I can advise you that there's a case right now that says this is okay.
Well, but then, so this is maybe a little bit angels dancing on the head of the pin. The state statute says appropriately competitive policies, but yet the state statute itself, as well as our ordinance, allows for a lot of non-competitive.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it.
So,
Yeah.
So, the state statute itself.
I would love to argue what you're talking about in front of the Supreme Court, see if that passes. It would be a fun argument.
Yeah.
But what benefits me does not necessarily benefit the town of Kiel sometimes. So.
Well, I mean, again, that's one of the examples. It strikes me, I mean, yes, you can, to go through with this next contract. Is it an annual contract? I can't remember the one we're talking about. Okay, and if it comes up, I guess to spend 2 months going through the exercise, just fine to just to deal with a potential challenge that I don't think would be well-founded. I don't know, but no, I hear what you're saying. But we don't have to, we're not at that bridge right now, because this simply just, we've given ourselves the authority to exempt.
Okay, I have 2 other questions, Mr. Mayor. So I'm assuming we're going to change the language for number 1, and the mayor assigns a committee. Did we agree on that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, to my questions, when you go back to page 1, the general provisions, B2, reporting to town council. It should be the policy of the town that any contractual obligation on $20,000 should be reported to town council. When? Before or after we've initiated it, or when's going to be reported? And again, I'm coming from the mindset of the audit.
And by the way, I'm not convinced now, having reread that the reporting should be to the town council opposed to Ways and Means. Approval by council, but reporting to Ways and Means.
Okay.
But that's a good question. It's typical.
Okay.
I agree, Ways and Means, but when?
You're
Before?
asking about whether before the purchase or after?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's unclear.
I would say prior to the purchase, but that might delay it 30 days. Is that? Because if you have to have an audit trail, you can't say reported and, well, we got it done by the end of the year, so.
Well,
Within
I
30
believe
days.
when I asked somebody about this in the city of Charleston, the reported to is an after the fact thing, but that may not be what we want.
I mean, the way this is written now, it's ambiguous, so it could be both. It could be before.
I'm okay with either one. I would probably prefer before, but I don't want to hold up the real-time processing of things, so,
Well, clearly, the 100,000 is before.
No doubt about it.
There's no question, because it has to be approved by town council, so it can't be executed. The question is then, do you want, so, and there's no, you could say reporting to Ways and Means between 20 and 100, the question is that literally just a documentation of what was done, or is that, and the question if it's reporting to beforehand, with what purpose?
just managing the budget.
Other than just,
Managing the budget.
informational. And then that may be fine, in which case, the administration, which would have the authority to execute that contract,
Do
may
you all
be
get any sort
informed.
of monthly or weekly report or anything separate and apart from your agenda packet, meeting packets?
Ways and Means. Yeah.
The budget updates from the finance director.
I don't know how we're going to get through all
Ways and
this
Means
today,
got
'cause
it.
if we're going to page term, because I think we should page term. 'cause
I just
That's
have one
why-
other
that's why we
thing.
said-
I'm okay with I just have one other thing after this one. Can we go with before and see if that works? If it doesn't work, we could change it? Report to Ways and Means prior to the disbursement of funds? Or prior to
No, it's
execution?
prior to execution of
Prior
the
to execution?
contract. It shall be the policy of the town that any contractual obligation shall be reported to Ways and Means Committee prior to execution of the obligation or entering into the obligation, and any proposed contractual obligation must be approved by town council greater than 100,000.
Okay, so Ways and Means prior to execution. Okay? And then the other thing is, okay. A lot of these, but I'm going to use page 2, number 8. The mayor or his designee, they'll make all the decisions. How will we know whether it's you or whether you've designated somebody?
Well, there needs to be, administrative policies and procedures, something written. For example, we've just come up with this conversation in the past, for the special events manager has really been executing the little contracts with the artists and all that. That's fine, but there should be a delegation. Document letter from me delegating that authority to that person.
Okay, if that's happened someplace, we can figure out where later. I'm
Put
looking
that in
from.
here as set forth in writing. I mean, we can put that in here. Maybe you can put it someplace else.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But in here, we could
Okay.
make clear that it's designated as set forth in
And I
writing.
think that's good, because
good.
we've had these issues or questions have arisen in the past where is that written? Where is, I don't see, well, it was just verbal, and that's probably
And
not.
it could be with the project pack, or we could keep it in a separate notebook. It just logs who's designated it.
One of the things is, again, gets a little further afield that we do need to do is come up with a written, we're kind of starting down this process in a couple of areas, but more systematically, written documentation of administrative policies and procedures.
And again,
all kind of in a.
I agree.
As much fun as this?
Pardon?
Would that be as much fun as this?
I agree. I'm just trying to come back to audit this,
Laugh a
okay?
minute.
You designated somebody approved it. If I'm auditing it,
Yep.
I need to know where to go to audit it. So that's great. That's the only two things I had that were
All
beyond.
right, so I'm going to be quick because we have so much to go through, and one of them is just a verbiage on page 2, paragraph number 3, talks about for the design services to design a building project, it really should be
A project.
a construction project. I mean, it's going to be more than just a building.
Does it, okay, construction covers kind of, that's more generic, yeah.
Yes, that was the whole.
Wait, no, to design, so, well, it's not actually, the first one, just delete building, I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm okay.
Just delete building.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
It literally just delete building, the second one delete, and for construction of the project, delete building in both places.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Which number are we on?
This is number 3, design, bid, build.
Page 2, number 3, top of
Oh,
the
design,
page.
okay.
So the first for design services to design a project, and the second for construction of the project, according to the design.
Okay, so I'm now on page number 6, and this has to do for requests for proposals. This is a general comment because it states here under number 2, notice of request for proposals, and it talks about having the proposals publicly announced on the website or South Carolina Business Opportunities. We're talking about the building here that we're going to go pursue. We need to have the ability to reach out on our own, out of state, to the proper kinds of arts center architects that we want.
That's a good point. I would argue it's implied that you can do that, but I have seen policies and actually done some that they'll have parenthetically, nothing here will prevent the town.
Yes.
from-
And
That's a
that
good point. Yeah.
does show up in a couple of other places,
Yeah.
but yes, I'm fine there, because I agree. We want to, this is not intended to be limiting. This is intended to be a minimum, but we can be
Right.
explicit.
Okay.
that
Because
it's-
you do want to go, hey, we're putting out an RFP. I want you to make sure you see it.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'd love for you to
Correct,
respond.
correct, okay. Same page, paragraph number 4, evaluation factors. It talks about in the second line, you need not require numerical weightings. I think you have to be explicit in any kind of solicitation we put out there and define
Which
how
one
we're
is it?
going
Which
to
one?
weight
I
them.
disagree.
On
I
page.
disagree.
I disagree.
Yeah.
Yeah, Madeline and I would firmly disagree. We don't want numerical weightings.
I'm sorry, which
Oh,
one
you-
is this?
It's for something like,
Oh, yeah, we don't.
well, we do that now for when we selected the consultant for the police study. But when you're going to select an architect, you need to go through what's his experience, you get a weighting for that. How large of a project can he do? Does he have the proper expertise? It's an evaluation
Okay.
procedure.
So I agree with you on the categories, but you might have an architect that's really good at historical something and another one is not so good at historical.
Yeah.
So if you weight it, then you're going to exclude this guy where,
Well, and this doesn't preclude you from doing it.
That's right.
Again,
it doesn't preclude you.
I will say, way back in the day, I had a person who was a vice admiral in the Navy who was over the entire procurement, and I hired him as an expert witness, and he actually taught me a lot about it. His take was always to never use numerical weighting, and to always use what he called adjectival weighting, where you would go, and basically as a committee, you come together and say, all right, what do we say about this set of criteria for the architects, and you come up with, you can be good, better, excellent, and whatever you want to do. And so that way, to your point, when you get the numbering on the protest, someone goes, wait a minute, I scored a 94, and this firm scored a 92, and they got the award.
yeah.
All right, the reason why I'm bringing it up, because what's likely going to happen, and I've been down this road too many times, where you get the best 2 or 3 out of the bunch, and you want to interview the best 2 out of 3 out of the bunch. And so you interview each one of them, and boy, they're close.
Yep.
And it's shades of gray different. So the evaluation committee needs to have something to rely on as to how we're going to rank them. Otherwise, it's just the biggest voice in the room is going to say, I want this guy because he's the biggest guy in the biggest voice in the room.
I agree, and so, again, you could, and I don't disagree with using numerical ranking, because I said you just don't have to. I kind of like using numerical ranking, but there's only one scorekeeper. Instead of everybody on the committee's got their own, that's where you really get into a problem. Everybody on, say you're all on the selection committee, scores a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 10, and you go, wait a minute, how are these all adding up? And so instead, the chairman of the selection committee goes, all right, are we good with a 7 here? No, I think it should be a 6. No, I think it should be an 8. You all then, as a consensus, you come up with a 7. And that's hard to beat.
But because part of the problem you get into is I've been on these kinds of qualitative selections is how much is the price going to be in that weighting? 10%, 20%, 90%?
Yeah.
So think about it like this. I think if we require ourselves to use numerical ratings, that's going to lock us into something. But if we don't require it, but if we get into, like, there's 2 people we like or 2 companies, the committee can say, okay, write down 1 or 2 or 1, 2, 3 and decide numerically within the committee. But that's just one of the tools to get us there. It's not a requirement of how we're going to select them.
Right, I like having the option because there are just going to be some projects that are more quantitative and some that are more
Some more qualitative, that's absolutely right. And
This is only for the qualitative ones,
Well-
in my mind.
But
Well, then we
Because
just keep it
otherwise,
out of
it's a
the.
hard bid.
well.
I was only bringing this up as a
for
tool to
example,
help us decide.
One that's coming up, we're about ready to go out with bid for the landscape contract. There are actually a numerical weightings and evaluation factors there. And the largest weighting is price, but there are a couple of qualitative elements. But that's one where it's going to be primarily, but not exclusively, driven by price. So the lowest price bidder may not get it because they don't meet the other qualitative factors. But there are some where price is just not the principal
Right.
consideration. So we want to have the flexibility to be able to choose who is the best service provider in the interest of the town.
No, I completely agree with that comment. I just was bringing it up. We need then the selection committee a mechanism to figure it out. And what I'm hearing now is that instead of having a prescribed methodology, we're going to do it on an ad hoc basis. We'll figure it out when we get there. And I was trying to figure it, we'll figure it out when we get there.
Well, it does say the request for proposal shall state the relative importance of each evaluation factor. So, and that's the committee is looking at the evaluation factors. It just may not be, the price may be.
I understand. I like having a formula instead of figuring it out when we get there.
But that's up to the selection committee.
Yep.
Just giving you I don't like being undefined. But okay, I'm not winning that argument, so we can.
Madeline and I have had bad experiences with that arrest. That's why we're. What else?
I don't think I have any others. Everything else we've talked about. Oh, so one thing, I'm sorry, there's another comment I have here to discuss. On page 11, and it's really kind of a comment for all of these selection criteria, is a withdrawal of bids. If a contractor makes an error, or I should say, if a bidder makes an error, he should be allowed to withdraw the bid because you don't want to force a company to perform and lose money. Because usually what happens then, in order to perform and not lose money, you get shoddy work. So in any of these methods of source selection, I would like to have words in there, and we can discuss it, whether or not you want to have the bidder the ability to withdraw his bid if he finds an error.
May I make a suggestion?
Yes.
What if we put, after written approval of the mayor, such approval not to be unreasonably withheld? So, you know, a lot of times a contractor will come in there and go, oh, I made an error, and they just realize they just bid it wrong.
Exactly,
You know, and
yeah.
sometimes it truly is a scrivener's error. And and I agree, that is not fair to put on a contractor when they make a scrivener's error to hold them to the contract. But if they just underbid it, then
That's different. No,
I know, but some contractors will say, oh, I made a bad mistake. I never would have done that bid. You go, come on, man, you just went too low, and now you're seeing somebody else's bid,
Yeah.
and you want to get out of it. And so I think, I agree with your point. I'm just trying to figure out how to write that in there to say, if we just say, we let a contractor out with a mistake, every time a contractor wants to get out of the bid, they'll say, oh, I made a mistake, and your procurement policy says you gotta let me out.
Well, I agree. If he underbid and that's one thing, and he could have received a higher contract award if he went higher, but I have seen scrivener errors before resulting in a low bid being awarded and the contractor is just saying, guys, I can't do it at this
Yeah,
price.
and I agree with that. I agree with that situation where there's a true scrivener's error. And I'll say, I mean, I've known a lot of people who, when the contractor has just missed it, it's just a bad bid.
Yeah.
And even then, the municipality will say, for exactly what you just said, they'll say, all right, you're out of it. You can get out of it. We're not gonna ding you on your bid bond or anything else. We'll let you out of it.
Okay.
For that reason.
Yeah.
But I do think
Are
there's
you
some.
fine with his?
I am.
Okay.
Okay, with that, please.
What happens next, though? And I imagine there's a time frame window of this, but without the town having to go through a new procurement, do we go to the next most qualified?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should we be clear about that?
Yeah, it goes to the next lowest.
Yeah, typically if it's somebody, you go next low. Yeah.
Should we put that in as well then?
Well, you can. it
We
doesn't
can
hurt.
to make it clear, I mean, that's
Doesn't hurt.
typical, just sort of, but that's not a bad point to put that in there, the next low, yeah.
Well, I mean, this is, what you're talking about, the C in that language is only under
Reverse auctions.
reverse
I
auction.
know, but I wanted, and if you recall, I said for all of the source selection methods, I wanted to put that ability to withdraw your bid if you have an error.
I'm okay with that. We just need to put it so that it's someplace in here that applies to all
Yeah, the only
methods of
place
source
that's gonna be
selection.
there is with a sealed bid.
Yeah.
With the auction and the bid, because in a proposal, you're negotiating
You're
that
you're
contract.
back and forth, you're negotiating, and specifically RFQ and RFP,
Yes,
there's a
and that's true. If
negotiation
you ne-
process.
right,
If
if
you're
you're
not able to
negotiating.
enter into a satisfactory contract with the preferred bidder, then you go to the next one.
Yeah, that's valid. When you're negotiating, of course you don't.
Okay.
That's valid.
And this is just the first reading, right, of this?
Yes, yes.
So we're going to get a chance to look through all this with the changes again.
We get to do this again.
So if there is no further discussion at this point in time, what I would propose is we've got a motion pending that prior to second reading, we'll come back with the changes discussed. There's going to be a couple of other little cleanups and conforming items. There may be some other issues that may be identified in the interim, and I'll continue to work with council. If any of the council members have any further comments or suggestions, we can certainly incorporate those prior to second reading. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Mr. Mayor?
Aye.
Mr. Mayor,
Aye.
Yeah.
You need to make a motion to accept all the amendments, because the first motion was just to accept the actual document. So you probably have to make a motion to accept all the discussions or something, kind of package it together.
Well, do we actually have to, or could those just be in second reading? Because we can make other changes as well, but that's
Can,
fine. I propose to, entertain a motion to approve upon first reading the ordinance 2025-07 with the various modifications discussed during the course of this special call meeting.
So moved.
Just said.
And second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Now, we are actually,
Need a
next
motion.
item of business
I'm sorry.
is to go into executive session to receive legal advice with regard to a pending legal matter, lawsuit concerning Captain Sam Spitt. May I have a motion to go into executive session, please?
So moved.
Second?
Any discussion? We are approved into executive session. Thank you.
Nick, very nice meeting you. Thanks for my call.
Take care.
Oh,
entertain a motion to leave executive session and return to regular business.
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Aye. The council just exited executive session to discuss matters related to pending litigation involving Captain Sam Spit. No decisions were made, no actions were taken. What I would note for the benefit of the community is that the town, along with the co-plaintiffs in the litigation that we commenced, the ARDA litigation against the partners, have agreed to enter into a mediation process that it would involve those three parties, as well as the current landowner, as well as the state of South Carolina, because there's a separate legal matter that the current landowner had initiated against the state for a takings claim going back to 2008 and 2009. So all of those matters will be part of the mediation process. The mediation process itself is a confidential one, so there's going to be a limited amount of what we can report out pursuant to those mediation discussions, but we'll do our level best to keep the community apprised of developments as we can discuss them. Any other questions or comments about that?
None.
Any citizen comments? None. Then I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second?
We are adjourned. Thank you.